People ask me why I stayed at Pharaoh's Cut so long. 11 years on a rock that didn't even have a real name until the survey crew got lazy and called it after the man who first cut a road through the ridge. 11 years cooking for men who'd forget my face the day their rotation ended. And I tell them the truth, which is that I didn't stay for any of them. I stayed because of 4 children and a question. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up. Let me tell it the way it happened, because if I jump to the end you won't believe the middle, and the middle is the part that still keeps me up at night. So Pharaoh's Cut. If you've never been out past the verge, you don't really have a picture for it, and I'm not sure I can give you one. Imagine a valley that the wind never finishes with. Imagine red dust that gets into everything, your boots, your food, the seams of your eyelids, and a sky the color of an old bruise most days, going on weeks. The settlement sat in a long scar of low ground between 2 ridges, and the depot sat at the bottom of the scar like a coin dropped down a drain. That depot was mine. Well, mine the way a kitchen is ever anybody's. I ran the mess and the rethermalizers and the long cold lockers and the water reclaim, and I kept the books on every gram of protein that came up the supply line and every gram that went out. The Concord billed it as a joint logistics node. What that meant in plain talk was, humans had pushed out this far, the Concord had pushed out to meet us, and somebody decided the cheapest thing to do was share a warehouse instead of shooting over one. So we shared, sort of. The humans were a Verge Battalion detachment, maybe 40 of us when the rotation was full, working salvage and road and relay. The Concord side was a garrison of Drenic auxiliaries, big, slab-shouldered things, plated down the back like they'd been poured into armor and left to set. Their officer was a sub-marshal named Veth, and I'll get to him. The 2 halves of the depot met at a line painted on the floor. An actual line, yellow, peeling. On our side the kitchen, the bunk rows, the machine shop. On their side their barracks and their motor pool and their drone bay, where the sentry units hung from the ceiling racks in long sleeping rows like bats. You learn not to cross the line. Not because anybody'd written a rule. Because the Drenic didn't like it, and a thing that weighs 400 kilos doesn't have to like you twice. I'd been there 9 years when the children came, so I want you to understand I wasn't new. I wasn't soft. I'd buried 2 men off that detachment and shipped home what was left of a third. I knew how that place worked. I knew what it cost to forget where the line was. That's what makes the rest of it matter. It was the end of a long-haul week. We'd had a convoy come up the Ridge Road, and a convoy meant double meals, and double meals meant I'd been on my feet from before the lights came up till after they dimmed. By the time the last tray went through the wash, I had that ringing tiredness where your hands keep working after your head has clocked out. I'd carried the day's scrap out to the recycler myself, because the kid who usually did it, a private named Osai, good boy, dead now, but not yet, not in this part of the story, had a hand crushed in a loader 2 days before and was strapped up in the infirmary feeling sorry for himself. So it was me, alone, out at the recycler bay in the blue end of the evening. The recycler was an old Concord pattern unit, a hulking gray thing that ate organic waste and broke it down into slurry for the algae tanks. It hummed. It always hummed, low in your teeth. There was a chute on the side where you tipped the scrap, and a grate over a drain where the gray water ran off, and a single sodium lamp overhead that the bugs loved. I remember the bugs. Little pale moths that didn't belong on that world, that must have come up in a crate years before and decided to stay, the way I had. I had the scrap bin balanced on my hip, and I was reaching for the chute lever when a voice said, "Can we have your leftovers?" I want to tell you I jumped. I didn't quite, but my whole spine went cold and tight because I knew that voice was small, and there are no small things out past the verge that aren't dangerous, and I knew it had asked in clean trade standard, and I knew this is the part. I knew it had said please with its body before it said the words, because the voice came from low down and from the shadow at the edge of the lamp. The way you make yourself small when you've learned that being seen is the thing that hurts you. I set the bin down slow. I turned slower. There were 4 of them. Now, I'd seen Drenic younglings once on a transport, and they're horrible, frankly, all jaw and joint, like spiders made of furniture. I'd seen conquered client species kids on the relay feeds, but I had never in 9 years out there seen a child standing in the dust at the edge of my lamplight with its hands held out flat in front of it, palms up, fingers spread. The oldest universal sign there is for I am not holding anything. I am not a threat. I am only hungry. The biggest of them stood in front. I'd learn her name later, but in that moment she was just the one in front, maybe waist high to me, wrapped in what I first took for rags and later understood was insulation foil stripped out of a cargo liner and folded careful into something that almost worked as a coat. Behind her, 3 smaller ones. One of them so small it was holding the next one's hand and swaying on its feet. And their eyes. I have to do this carefully because it's the thing the title of every cheap relay drama would lean on, and I don't want to cheapen it. But their eyes were blue. Not human blue. A deeper thing, lit from somewhere behind, the way you see a gas flame go blue at its hottest part. In the bad light they were the brightest thing in that whole bay. 4 pairs of them, all turned up at me, and the oldest ones were the steadiest. And the smallest ones kept slipping closed and then snapping back open, fighting sleep and losing and winning and losing. I knew what they were the second I really looked, and that knowing dropped through me like a stone down a well. Because the Conquered had told us 4 years before that there were none left. Let me explain, because you need to understand this part or the rest is just a story about a man feeding some kids, and it's more than that. It has to be more than that, or those 11 years were for nothing. When humans first pushed out to the verge, the Conquered was already there, and so were a lot of other people, small folk, planet-bound folk, species the Conquered called client populations, which is a polite word for the ones who got there first and didn't have a fleet to argue with. The Veil were one of those. Little people. Blue-eyed. They'd lived on a string of worlds along the inner verge for longer than anybody had records for, fishing the deep cold seas and keeping to themselves. Then there was the thing the Conquered called the resettlement. You'd hear it in their official traffic, dry as old bread. The Veil populations have been resettled to managed care reserves following ecological collapse of their home systems. That was the line. Ecological collapse. Managed care. We didn't think about it much, to be honest, because we were busy not dying, and because the Conquered said it the way you say a thing you've decided is finished. Resettled, gone, filed. And here were 4 of them, in my recycler bay, asking for my leftovers. The oldest one was still holding her hands out. She hadn't moved them. Her arms must have been screaming. I realized she'd been holding them out the whole time I'd been starring, holding still, letting me look, the way you hold still for an animal you don't want to spook. Except she was the one with everything to lose, and she was the one being patient with me. "Put your hands down," I said. My voice came out rough. "Please put your hands down." She did slowly, watching me. I looked at the scrap bin. It was end-of-day scrap. Trimmings, the burnt edges off the protein loaf, the heel ends of the bread that the men wouldn't touch, a quarter tray of the stew that had sat too long and gone gluey. Garbage. I'd been about to feed it to a machine. I'm not going to pretend I had some grand thought. I didn't. What I had was a kitchen 40 steps behind me with hot food still in the warmer because I always made too much. Every cook does. It's the one superstition we all keep. You never want to be the cook who ran out. What I had was the simple, stupid animal fact of a small one swaying on its feet. "Don't move," I said. "Don't just stay. I'll be right back. Stay there." And I went back to my kitchen, and I built 4 trays. I'm telling you, I built them properly too. I want you to know that. I didn't scrape garbage into a dish and hand it over. Some part of me, the part that had been a cook for 20 years before I ever saw a star up close, that part took over and wouldn't let me do it cheap. Hot protein cut small. The good bread, not the heels. Broth, because if they were as far gone as they looked, the broth would sit easier than solid food. Water, clean water, 2 cups each, because I clocked the cracked lips and the gray tongue on the little one when it had yawned. My hands were shaking. I noticed that. I'd field-dressed a man's leg open to the bone without my hands shaking, and here they were, shaking over 4 bowls of broth. When I came back out, they hadn't moved. That stayed with me too. 4 children alone in the dark on a world that wanted them dead, and a strange, enormous alien had just told them to stay, and they'd stayed. Either because they trusted me, which was insane, or because they were too tired to run, which was worse. I set the trays down on the lip of the recycler housing, low, where they could reach. The oldest one didn't move toward hers. She looked at the food, then at me, then she did something I didn't understand at first. She took her tray, and she turned, and she put it in front of the smallest one. Then she took the next tray and gave it to the next smallest. Then the third. And only when all 3 of the others had food in front of them did she pick up the last tray for herself. She fed them first, every time. I learned that was just how she was. But the first time I saw it in that lamplight, with the moths coming down, something in my chest came apart that has never gone all the way back together. They ate the way starving things eat, which is not the way you'd think. Not fast, careful, like they couldn't quite believe it and were afraid that going too fast would wake them up. The smallest one got broth on its chin, and the oldest one wiped it with the edge of her foil coat without even looking, an automatic gesture, a thing she'd done 1,000 times. "What's your name?" I asked her, quietly, the way you'd ask anything you were afraid would bolt. She looked up, considered me, decided. "Soon," she said. Then, after a moment, like she was offering me something valuable, she touched the smallest one's head and said, "Eli." The next, "Pell." The third, "Tam." "I'm Marsh," I said. "Tobin Marsh. The men call me Cook." "Cook," she repeated, trying the weight of it. "How long since you ate, Soon?" She thought about it. Not the way a child thinks, counting on fingers. The way someone old thinks, deciding how much of the truth you can be trusted with. 11 days, she said. "Real food. There's the grease traps behind the Concord side. We get into the grease traps sometimes." I want you to sit with that. There were children living on the runoff of a Concord garrison's grease traps, 40 steps from a kitchen with food going into a machine every single night. And the only thing between those 2 facts was a yellow line painted on a floor. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in my bunk and I did the math, the cold math, the kind I'm good at because keeping books out past the verge is half arithmetic and half knowing what you can hide. 4 children, maybe 2,000 calories a day each if I wanted them to actually come back from where they were. 8,000 calories. I overproduced by maybe 15,000 a day. I could feed 4 children on the slack in my own kitchen and never show a gram missing on the books, as long as nobody looked too hard. And the second thought, right behind it, cold as the first. The Concord said there were none left. If there were none left, and there were 4 behind my recycler, then somewhere a lie had a hole in it. And the people who tell that kind of lie do not like holes. They came back the next night. I'd half convinced myself they wouldn't, that I'd dreamed it, or that they'd been a patrol's leavings, a one-time thing, gone by morning. But I went out to the recycler at the same blue hour, alone again, and the trays I'd left out were stacked neat by the chute, scraped clean, rinsed in the gray water runoff, set out to dry, and the 4 of them were waiting in the shadow. This time the little one, Eli, came forward a step ahead of Soon. Just a step, just enough that I understood it as a gift. I fed them, and the night after, and the night after that. I learned things in pieces, the way you learn anything from a child who's been taught not to talk. I learned the foil coats weren't a one-time clever thing. Soon had made all 4, cut and folded from a wrecked liner 2 ridges over, and she remade them when they tore, and she taught Pell how to do the folding so that if anything happened to her, the others would still be warm. That's what she said. If anything happens to me. 11 years old, near enough, and already building redundancy into the survival of the people she loved. I learned they slept in a culvert under the Ridge Road, a drainage pipe wide enough to crawl into, dry most of the year. I learned there'd been 5 of them once, and there was a way Soon's face closed when the number came up that taught me not to ask about the 5th. I learned that they were the last. Not the last anywhere. Soon wasn't sure about that, and I wasn't going to be the one to take her hope. But the last on Pharaoh's Cut. The last of a group that had been brought there, she said, in a big gray ship, all the veil from her sea, and offloaded at a camp 2 valleys over with a fence and a gate and conquered auxiliaries on the towers. The managed care reserve. She remembered the fence. She remembered the food getting smaller and the people getting fewer. She remembered the day her mother put her, and the others through a gap under the fence where the ground had washed out, and told her to run for the lights of the depot and not to look back. She ran, she didn't look back. That was 3 years before she stood in my recycler bay. 3 years, 4 children, a culvert, greased traps. I'm not a man who cries easy. I didn't cry then, but I went into the machine shop after she told me that, and I broke a perfectly good mug against the wall, and I picked up every piece of it afterwards so nobody would ask, and I think that's the closest thing I have to crying these days. Here's the thing about secrets in a place that small. You can't keep them, not really. You can only choose who finds out first. Osa found out first. He was back on light duty by then, hands still strapped, and he caught me building 4 extra trays one evening with the careful concentration of a man who's hidden something before. He didn't say anything that night. He just watched. The next night he was beside me, his good hand cutting protein small, the way I'd been doing it because he'd watched and understood without being told. How long, he said, not a question really. Few weeks. How many? 4. He nodded slowly. He was 19. He had a kid sister back home he never shut up about. The little one swaying like that, he said. That's not just hungry, that's the cold getting into them. They need somewhere warm. He was right, and I'd known he was right, and I'd been afraid of it, because warm meant inside, and inside meant the depot, and the depot meant the line on the floor and the things on the other side of it. But it was coming into the cold season. The culvert that was dry most of the year wouldn't be dry much longer, and the nights were already dropping past where a folded foil coat could carry a body through till morning. I'd seen Eli's lips go from gray to a bad blue that wasn't anything to do with the species. So we made a place, Osa and me. Behind the long cold lockers there was a dead space, an old pump room, dry, with a heat exchanger running through the wall that kept it warm without me ever touching the depot's books. We cleared it. We laid down packing foam and thermal blankets pulled 3 at a time from stores over 3 weeks so the count never jumped. We rigged a light on a low setting. It wasn't much. It was a room behind a machine. But it was warm, and it had a door that locked from the inside. And the night we brought them in and showed them, Soon stood in the doorway for a long time without going in, like she was waiting for the trick. There wasn't a trick. She went in last, after the others, of course she did. For a while, and I know how this sounds, for a while it was almost good. I don't want to lie to you and say it was happy, because there's no happy in living behind a wall in a warehouse on a world that's filed you under deceased. But the children came back. That's the thing about feeding the starving, the thing nobody tells you. They come back. Eli's lips went from blue to gray to something almost healthy. Pell laughed once, a small thing. Startled out of him by Os, doing something stupid with a ration wrapper, and then clapped both hands over his mouth, terrified, like he'd dropped something that might break. Tam, the third, turned out to be clever with machines, and would sit by the heat exchanger taking apart and rebuilding a busted hand light I gave her, over and over, until she could do it blind. And soon started to sleep. That doesn't sound like much, but the first weeks she didn't. She'd put the others down and then sit up against the wall facing the door, all night, every night, watching. I'd come in before dawn with breakfast and find 3 children breathing slow and even, and 1 set of blue eyes already open and on me. It took a month before I came in and found all 4 asleep. All 4. and Soon's face in sleep was a child's face, finally, just for those hours, all that command and arithmetic gone soft. I stood in that doorway and I watched 4 children sleep safe and warm and fed, and I thought, I did that. Whatever else I am, whatever I've done, I did that. I should have known better than to think a thing like that out loud, even just inside my own head. The Verge has ears. The Drennick knew. I think they'd known longer than I'd realized. You don't keep anything from a garrison of 400-kilo soldiers in a shared warehouse. Not really. They'd have smelled the extra cooking, clocked the missing blankets in the shared inventory, heard small feet where small feet shouldn't be. But the Drennick, for the most part, didn't care about us. We were the other half of the warehouse. We cooked and we salvaged, and we kept to our side and they kept to theirs. And as long as the line held, they'd watch a thing for months without it ever rising to the level of their problem. Until it rose to the level of Veth's problem. Submarshal Veth, I told you I'd get to him. He was old for a Drennick, plated gray going to white at the joints, and he had a way of being still that the younger ones didn't have, a deliberate stillness, the stillness of something that has decided it has all the time in the world to deal with you. He'd been at Pharaoh's Cut longer than I had. He'd signed the same dry traffic the rest of them had, Vale populations resettled following ecological collapse, and I came to understand, later, that of all the Drennick on that rock, he was the one who knew best exactly what that sentence had been built to cover. He came to my kitchen on a gray morning, alone, which was its own kind of message. The Drennick moved in pairs as a rule. Veth came alone, and he stood on his side of the yellow line, and he watched me work for a while before he spoke, in that flat, translated voice their gorget units gave them. You have acquired livestock, cook. I kept cutting protein, small, the way I'd learned. I've got a kitchen to run, Submarshal. 4 units, he said. Vale juveniles, you are feeding them from this node's logistics. I'm feeding them off my own slack. Nothing's gone from the books. You're welcome to check the books. I have checked the books. Of course he had. The books are not the matter is the units. The Vale were resettled. To possess unresettled Vale is to possess a discrepancy. Discrepancies are reconciled. I'd never heard a thing like that said so plain. Reconciled. I set the knife down. I crossed to the line, not over it, just to it, and I looked up at him because he was half again my height, and I said the only thing I had, which was the truth. They're children. And Veth was quiet for a moment, and I'll give him this, whatever came after. He didn't pretend not to understand me. Yes, he said, that is the difficulty. If they were not, this would already be done. Then he told me how it would go, in that flat voice, like reading me the weather. There was a reconciliation team. Conquered internal, not garrison, the people who handled discrepancies. They moved on a schedule, system to system, cleaning up the holes in the official story. They were due through the Pharaoh's Cut sector in 19 days. When they came, they would sweep the node, because a node with a known discrepancy got swept, and they would find 4 Vale juveniles, and they would do what reconciliation teams do, which Veth did not describe and did not need to. 19 days. Why are you telling me this? I asked him, because I couldn't make sense of it. He didn't have to warn me. He could have just let the team come. Veth was still for a long, long moment, the longest I ever saw him hold it. I have been reconciling discrepancies for 40 years, cook, he said finally. I find that I have begun to count them. I did not used to count them. He turned to go. At the line he stopped without looking back. 19 days I am garrison. I will not act against the team, but I am not the team. Until they arrive I have not seen your livestock. Do with that what you can. And he left. 19 days to make 4 filed dead children disappear off a world that had a wall around it, and a garrison in it, and a reconciliation team inbound. And the only help I had was a 19-year-old private with one good hand, and a 400-kilo alien who'd promised me nothing except 19 days of pretending not to look. That night I sat in the warm pump room while the children slept, and Os sat across from me, and we tried to make a plan out of nothing. We had no ship. The supply convoys came up the ridge road, ground transport, and went back empty-ish. But they were conquered contracted and conquered searched, and you do not smuggle a discrepancy past a conquered search, not four of them, not breathing. We had no allies. The human detachment was 40 men who'd be rotated out and scattered before they could help, and bringing them in only spread the secret wider and gave Veths, I have not seen your livestock, a wider crack to fall through. We had 19 days and a kitchen and a yellow line. I looked at Soon, asleep, one arm thrown over Eli the way she always slept once she'd finally let herself, and I thought about what she'd told me weeks before. The gap under the fence. The day her mother pushed her through a washed-out place in the ground and told her to run. The reserve. The camp 2 valleys over with the fence and the towers. It was empty now, Soon had said it, the day she'd let it slip about the food getting smaller and the people getting fewer until there were no people, just her 4, slipping out under the same fence her mother had found. An empty camp. A reconciled discrepancy. The conquered didn't go back to reconciled places. Why would they? There was nothing there to count. Nothing there to count. I didn't have the whole shape of it yet. But that was the night the first edge of it came to me, that the safest place on that whole world to hide a thing the conquered had decided was already gone, might be the one place the conquered had already crossed off its list. I just had to get 4 children across 2 valleys, past a garrison, with 19 days on the clock and Veth's stillness over my shoulder, without the team ever knowing they'd existed at all. Soon stirred in her sleep. Her eyes came half open, that blue, even in the low light, even half asleep, found me sitting there, found Osai, registered that the door was shut and the room was warm and the others were breathing. And then, for the first time since I'd met her, she let her eyes close again without fighting it. She trusted the room enough to stop watching it. She trusted me enough. I sat there a long time after that, in the hum of the heat exchanger, looking at a thing I had no right to and every reason to lose, and I made myself a promise I had no business being able to keep. I just didn't know yet what it was going to cost. 19 days is a strange amount of time. It's long enough that you can't just hold your breath through it, and it's short enough that you feel it draining the whole while, like watching the water go out of a cracked tank. You know the level, you can see the level. There's nothing you can do about the level except decide what you're going to do before it hits the bottom. I'll tell you how I spent the first 3 of them. I spent them being a coward. I told myself I was thinking, planning, gathering. But the truth is I went out to that warm room every night and I looked at 4 children who'd finally started to believe the world might let them live, and I couldn't make my mouth say the thing I had to say, which was, we have to leave the only safe place you've ever had, and we have to do it soon, and it's going to be cold and far and dangerous, and I can't promise you it'll work. Osai said it for me in the end. He was better with them than I was. He was closer to a kid himself, and the strap was off his hand by then, and he'd taught Pell a clapping game with a counting rhyme that the boy did under his breath now, even when Osai wasn't there. On the 4th night Osai sat down cross-legged in front of Soon, the way you sit to talk to someone you respect, and he laid it out. Plain. He didn't soften it because she'd have known if he had, and softening it would have insulted her. She listened the way she listened to everything, still weighing. The team that's coming, she said when he was done. They came to the camp before, at the end. I saw them from under the fence. She said it without any shake in her voice at all, and that flatness was worse than any crying could have been. I know what they are. Then you know why we go, Osei said. She nodded, once. Then she looked at me, past Osei at me, and she asked the only question that mattered to her, the question I'd have known she'd ask if I'd been thinking with my head instead of my fear. All of us, she said, or none? All of you, I said, I swear it. She studied me a moment longer, Whatever she saw, she decided to take it. "Tell me what to do," she said. And just like that, she wasn't a thing I was rescuing anymore. She was the fourth person in the plan. The plan, when it finally had a shape, was held together with luck and string, and I knew it. The reserve, the empty camp 2 valleys over, was the destination. I'd worked out the why of it by then, the way I'd half felt it that first night. A reconciled place doesn't get reconciled twice. The Concord's whole way of working was the file, the line in the traffic, the box ticked. Vale populations resettled following ecological collapse. The camp was the place where they'd made that sentence true. To them it was finished. Closed. A team that swept the depot and found nothing, no discrepancy, no juveniles, books clean, cook just a cook, would file the discrepancy as resolved, in error, and move on. They would not go back 2 valleys to a fence around nothing. If we could be the nothing. If by the time the team came, the 4 of them were somewhere the team had already decided was empty. The trouble was the getting there. 2 valleys. On foot with children, the youngest of whom couldn't make more than a few hours before flagging. No vehicle I could take without it being logged and missed. The ridge road ran the wrong way and was watched. The direct route went up over the saddle between the valleys, open ground, exposed to the Drenic drone base sentry units, which swept the high ground on a schedule I knew because I'd been listening to it hum overhead for 9 years without ever once needing to care about it. And Veth had told me the truth cleanly when he gave me the 19 days. I will not act against the team, but I am not the team. He'd look away from what I did inside the depot. He would not look away from a sentry sweep flagging 4 warm bodies crossing his garrison's open ground. That would be the team's business by the time it reached him, and he'd already told me where the line of his help ran out. So the drones were the problem. The drones and the cold and the distance and the clock. Tam solved the drones. I keep saying she was clever with machines. I don't think I understood how clever until the night I described the problem to all 4 of them, because I decided after soon that I'd treat them as people who got to know what was happening to them. And Tam, who'd barely said 10 words to me in all those weeks, who built and rebuilt that handlight by the heat exchanger every night, looked up and said, in a small, flat, practical voice, "The flying ones, they look for warm, they don't look for cold that was warm. We did it at the camp, under the foil. You go cold and they slide off you." The foil coats, of course. Soon hadn't built them just for warmth. She'd built them, or her mother had taught her to, or the camp had taught them all to hide. Insulation foil, the same stuff that kept a body's heat in, kept a body's heat from reading out. They'd been walking around under thermal cloaks the whole time, and I'd thought it was rags. "You'd freeze," Osei said, "wrapped up cold like that in the open all night." "Not all night," Tam said. "Between sweeps, we move when the warm finders go past, then we go cold and still until they come back, then we move again." She looked at me. "How long between the sweeps?" I knew that one. I'd known it for 9 years without knowing I knew it. 41 minutes, I said, give or take. She nodded like that settled it, and went back to her hand light. 41 minutes. We'd crossed 2 valleys in 41-minute pieces, moving in the gaps and going cold and dead still in the foil whenever the hum came over the ridge. With 4 children, the smallest of whom slept on his feet. In the cold season, with a reconciliation team's arrival closing on us like a door. It was a terrible plan. It was the only plan, so it was the plan. We had 11 days left when the weather turned, and the weather turning was the thing that nearly killed all of it before it began. A storm came down off the high country, the kind the men called a gray out, where the dust and the cold came together and the whole world went the color of nothing, and the temperature dropped past anything a foil coat could carry a small body through. It would have killed us in the open. There was no question. If we'd been out on the saddle when it hit, I'd have buried 4 children under a tarp, and that would have been the end of this story. But it also did something else. A gray out grounded the drones. You can't sweep what you can't see through, and the dust played hell with the warm finders. For 2 days the sentry units hung dead in their racks and the high ground went unwatched. I stood at the depot door watching the gray-out scream past, and I did the cold math one more time, the worst math I ever did. 2 days of cover, drones grounded, open ground unwatched, and a storm that would kill us if it caught us in the open. The window was the eye of it. Grayouts came in 2 walls with a lull between. I'd lived through enough to know the shape. First wall, then a lull, sometimes hours, where the dust dropped and the cold held and the air went still and clear and empty, and then the second wall. If we went in the lull, the drones would still be grounded from the first wall and slow to come back up, and the team, I'd checked the traffic. I had gotten me a look at the inbound schedule through a relay tech who owed him. The team's approach was weather-locked too. They'd hold off system till the gray-out cleared. The storm that could kill us was also the storm holding the door shut behind us. We'd have one lull, maybe 4 hours of it, to cross ground that should have taken a full cold night. I went and woke them. I want to tell this part slow, because it's the part that matters, and because I owe it to them to get it right. We went out in the lull, in the dead clear cold, 4 children and 2 men, every one of us wrapped to the eyes in foil. I carried Eli on my back, the smallest, bound to me with a cargo strap. His face turned in against my neck, and I could feel the cold coming off him through the foil, and I kept reaching back to make sure he was still breathing, and every time he was, every single time. And I have never in my life been so grateful for a thing so small as a child's breath against my collar. I took Pell. Soon took Tam's hand and would not let me carry her. Tam had the root. Tam watched the sky. Tam was the one of us who'd done this before, and soon stayed at her shoulder the whole way like she'd done at all their shoulders, all their lives. We crossed the depot perimeter through a gap in the back fence and I had cut 3 nights before and aged with rust, paste so it'd read as old damage. We went up the saddle in the dark and the cold, in the dead air, and the world was so quiet I could hear the foil whispering against itself with every step. It was 4 hours of the hardest walking I've ever done. The cold got into everything. Eli stopped shivering on my back about halfway, which I knew was bad, which Tam had warned me was bad, and I stopped right there on the open ground and I unwrapped my own coat and put him inside it against my body and wrapped us both back up and walked the rest of the way with a child's cold weight pressed to my chest, feeling for the warmth to come back into him, willing it back, and it came, slow, it came. Soon fell once. Going down the far side in the scree, her legs just went 3 years of culvert and grease trap finally cashing in, and she went down hard and I heard her breath go out of her. And before or I could even turn, Tam had her up. 11-year-old Soon, who'd carried all of them all that way, and her little sister got her up out of the scree and put Soon's arm over her own small shoulders and said something low in their own tongue. The only words of it I ever heard, and they went the rest of the way down like that, the smaller carrying the larger. Because that's what Soon had taught them in the end, not how to fold foil, that. We came to the fence in the last of the lull. The reserve, the camp, 2 valleys over. The fence still stood, gray and sagging, the towers empty, the gate hanging. And there was the washed-out place under it that Soon remembered that her mother had pushed her through 3 years and a lifetime before, grown wider now with 3 more years of weather. Soon stopped at the fence. She wouldn't go through. She stood looking at the gap in the dead light, and her face did the thing it did about the 5th child, the one she never named, and I understood that this was the place. This was where her mother had stood. This was the last ground she'd ever shared with everyone she'd lost. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. I just put my hand on her shoulder light, the way sat to talk to her, and I waited, and the second wall of the storm was a gray line coming down off the high country behind us, and we did not have time, and I gave her the time anyway, because some things you give even when you don't have them. She turned her face up to me, blue eyes wet steady. "You said all of us," she said. "All of you," I said. "I'm here, Osai's here, we go through together." and she went through. And I went through after her last, after all of them, because somewhere in those weeks I'd learned that from her too. The camp wasn't empty. That was the thing I hadn't planned for, the thing none of my cold math had reckoned. And it's the thing that turned a desperate gamble into something I still don't have the right words for, 11 years on. There were people there. Not many. 40, maybe 50, scattered through the dead buildings, living the way the children had been living, on nothing, in the dark, hidden, veil, blue-eyed. Other ones who'd slipped the gap, other ones who'd been pushed through fences by mothers and fathers in the last days, other ones who'd done what the children had done. Gone to the one place the conquered had already crossed off, and survived there, in the bones of the place that was supposed to have ended them, because the file said empty and nobody came back to check the file. They came out of the dead buildings when they saw us, slow, afraid. And then one of them, an old one bent, with that same blue gone pale in the eyes, saw the children and saw soon, and made a sound I'd never heard before and have never heard since. And the children ran, all 4 of them, into a crowd of their own people for the first time in 3 years. And I stood at the gap in the fence with the second storm wall coming down behind me, and I watched a thing I had no part in and had somehow made happen anyway. They knew soon, some of them knew her, from the camp from before. She wasn't a stranger arriving. She was a child coming home to the ruin of home, and the ruin of home still had arms in it. Osei was crying. He didn't bother hiding it. I let him not hide it. We stayed through the second wall. There was no choice, and there was no reason to go back into it. And the old veil took us in among them. 2 enormous strange aliens, because the children vouched for us, because soon stood in front of her own frightened people and put her flat-palmed hands out, the oldest sign there is, and pointed at us, and they understood. I learned that night in the dead camp in the storm what the place had become, not a graveyard, a hiding place. The conquered's perfect lie had built the veil a perfect refuge without meaning to, a place stamped finished on every map and in every file, a place no team would ever sweep because there was officially nothing left to find. They were growing food in the old fence-lined ditches. They had water. They had, against everything, a kind of life. They had just needed it to stay invisible. And 4 children feeding out of a conquered garrison's grease, traps 2 valleys over, had been the one thread that could have pulled the whole thing into the light. I'd thought I was hiding 4 children. I'd very nearly gotten 50 people reconciled. We went back, Osei and I. We had to. 2 missing humans would have been its own discrepancy, its own thread, and the whole point was leaving no thread for the team to pull. So when the storm broke, we slipped back over the saddle in the new gray dawn, 2 men and no children, through the rusted gap, and we were in our bunks before the lights came up like we'd never left. The team came 4 days later. They swept the node. They were exactly what Veth's voice had made me imagine, and worse for being so ordinary, not monsters, just clerks, just people with instruments and a list, walking my kitchen, scanning the warm room behind the cold lockers where 4 children had learned to sleep, finding it empty, finding the books clean, finding cook just a cook. They found nothing, because there was nothing. We'd stripped the warm room back to a dead pump room, returned the blankets to stores one at a time, scattered the foam. 4 children had lived there for months and left less trace than the moths left at the recycler lamp. I stood in my kitchen and cut protein small while a conquered clerk ran a scanner over my cold lockers, and I did not shake. Not that time. I'd done my shaking. I was empty of it. The discrepancy was filed resolved in error. The team left. The door I'd been trying to hold shut for 19 days clicked closed, and on the far side of it, 2 valleys over, 50 people the galaxy had crossed out went on living in the one place it would never look. Veth came to my kitchen one more time, the morning after the team cleared the system. He stood at the line. He watched me work. For a long while neither of us said anything. "The discrepancy is resolved," he said finally. "So I hear." In error, a pause. "There was no livestock. The cook keeps a clean book." That's right. He was quiet again. Then he said the thing I've carried longest, the thing I think he came to say, the thing I don't think he could have said to anyone else on that whole rock. I told you I had begun to count them, he said, the discrepancies, after 40 years. The flat translated voice didn't change, but he was choosing the word slow. A man does not count what he has decided is nothing. The day I began to count was the day I knew the sentence was a lie and I went on signing it. You did not sign it. He turned to go. At the line he stopped the way he always did. I will be at this node 4 more years. I will sweep the high ground on the same schedule. 41 minutes. He let that sit there, deliberate, a gift. I find I have stopped wishing to see what crosses it. And he left, and that was the last real conversation I ever had with him. And 4 years later, when he rotated out, he came to the line one final time and said nothing at all. Just stood there a moment in that stillness of his, and then was gone. 41 minutes. He just told me the door would stay propped, as much as a garrison soldier who would not act against the team could ever prop it. He'd done his counting, and he'd made his small choice, the only kind a man like him was ever allowed to make, and he'd told me in the only way he could. I never told him it mattered. I think he knew. So that's why I stayed 11 years. I stayed because every few weeks, in the gap between sweeps, in the 41 minutes, I went up over the saddle with a pack of the slack from my own kitchen. Never a gram off the books. I was a careful man. I kept a clean book and I left it at the gap in the fence. And the children grew. Soon grew tall and grew quiet and grew into the one the others looked to, the way she'd always been, except now there were 50 of them looking. Eli stopped being the smallest. Pell taught the counting game to children younger than himself. Tam fixed things, fixed everything by the end, kept the whole dead camp's salvaged machinery breathing. I watched them live, from the edge, from the gap in the fence. It was never my life. I was never one of them and I never pretended to be. That's the boundary you keep. With a thing like that, you don't make it about yourself. You don't make yourself the hero of someone else's survival. I was the cook who left food at the fence. That was enough. That was the most I'll ever be, and it's more than I ever expected to be, and I'd trade nothing for it. Osai died in my 8th year there. A loader, again, that same loader I had it scrapped after I couldn't look at it. He was 23. His kid sister got the letter I wrote, and I told her he'd been brave, which was true, and I didn't tell her about the children because that secret wasn't mine to spend, but I'll tell you he'd have wanted his sister to know. So I'm telling you instead. He cut protein small with one good hand, and he taught a frightened boy to laugh, and he carried Pell across 2 valleys in a dead cold lull. And he cried at a fence and didn't hide it. That was Osai. That's what 19 years old can be if it decides to. I left in my 11th year when my knees gave out and a cook who can't stand isn't a cook anymore. The night before I went, I made the last crossing. Soon met me at the gap, grown now, near as tall as me, the camp's keeper the way she'd been her family's keeper, the way she'd been since she was a child, holding her hands out flat in my lamplight. I didn't have a speech. I'm not a speech man. I gave her the last pack of slack and I told her I was going. She looked at me a long while with those eyes, that blue, the brightest thing in any light. The first night, she said, you told us to stay. We stayed because we were too tired to run. A pause, the ghost of something on her face that on anyone else would have been a smile. That's what I thought then, that we stayed because we were tired. She shook her head slow. We stayed because you said please. Nobody had said please to us in 3 years. We knew what a person was when we heard one. That's the thing I carry. Out of 11 years, out of all of it, that's the thing. Not the crossing, not the storm, not Veth's stillness or the team's empty scanners. Just that the whole of it turned on a tired man saying please to 4 hungry children in the dark, because some part of him that the Verge hadn't managed to kill yet still knew that's what you say to a person. People ask me why I stayed at Pharaoh's Cut so long, and I tell them, because 4 children asked me for my leftovers, and I looked at their eyes, and I had a choice between a yellow line painted on a floor and a thing I knew was a person. I'm not sorry which one I chose. Out past the verge, where the file says empty, where the galaxy stopped counting, there are 50 people living in the ruins of the place that was meant to end them. And the door's still propped, 41 minutes at a time. Go cold, stay still, move in the gap. And when something hungry comes out of the dark and holds its hands out flat to you, you'll know what it is. You'll know what a person is when you hear one. Say please and feed them first.